Wait, Hale. Today we're joined by Peter Grybauskas. He's an eminent Tolkien scholar and the editor of Tolkien's The Battle of Maldon together with The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, as well as the author of A Sense of Tales Untold, exploring the edges of Tolkien's literary canvas. He teaches at the University of Maryland, where he taught me, and where he also was a student himself under one of the very first and most influential Tolkien scholars, Verlyn Flieger. I might add that he is the recipient of the following review on Planet Terp, and I quote, "No glaze, this guy might be the funniest and best teacher at UMD," end quote. Prof G, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Graham. It's always a pleasure.
So, in your essay at the end of the Battle of Malden book, which my copy is right here, if anyone doesn't have this, I really recommend getting it. Um, at the end, you have an essay, and you pose the question: Is war romantic or merely waste? Um, I think that's a really interesting question, at least in terms of thinking about Tolkien's thought process. How do you think he would have answered that question?
Yeah, great question. Maybe the answer depends on at what point Tolkien's at in his life and his career. And I think maybe the Homecoming is a text where we get the most sort of sustained kind of exploration of that.
Uh-huh.
Um, So, hey, with the new collected poems, we can see a lot more of Tolkien's early, wartime poetry,
Mhm.
and I think there's a lot to be done with reading Tolkien alongside, Sassoon and Graves and the trench poets, right? And seeing that whole sort of generational shift from a sense of jollily marching out to war
Mhm.
and glory and coming back, maybe, probably not coming back, but if coming back, returning a shell, a shell of a person.
Yeah.
Uh, so we obviously see Tolkien, a real time in the trenches, right? And 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 of course living through the Second World War and having his children serve
Hmm.
that period too. So I don't think Tolkien's one with many illusions about the sort of personal pleasure or glory to be gained in war.
Hmm.
And yet here's a writer who's always puzzled critics by still writing about famous swords and cavalry
That's what
charge
I was gonna say. Yeah.
heroism, right? Um, so it's I mean, some of those early critics who panned the Lord of the Rings, right, and called it
Hmm.
boys of adventure, right, and saw it as this sort of like comical, almost comic book level sort of approach
Hmm.
uh, to uh, to to war, right? They obviously missed out on the fact that Tolkien's heroes are an unlikely bunch, right? And
Hmm.
don't come home from war without scars. Um, but I think that this is maybe a banal connection, but why do we ride on roller coasters, right? We ride and we vomit and we have the worst 90 seconds of our life and our change falls out of our pockets and then
What roller coasters are you riding on?
the scaredy cat. But and then we say and our friends say, how was it? And we're like, yeah, it was sick. You got to do it.
Hmm.
Let's do it again, right? We see Bilbo having that moment, right, in the Battle of Five Armies, right? He's immediately stunned by a rock and misses the whole thing, right?
Right.
Um, the narrator tells us, it was actually one of the things he was most fond of recounting in years later, right?
Hmm.
Hearing those old war stories.
That's interesting. I've never considered that. That it's he has this, because when I originally posed the question, I feel like the kind of expected response is to talk about all of the ways in which he hates war, the ways in which he, characterizes the dead marshes and stuff like that. And and yet everything, now that I'm saying this, everything that he has written practically everything at least has been in some way or another about war, or at least about like armed conflict. So he does seem to have this kind of love-hate relationship, and yeah, it's just like Bilbo, he hated the battle, and then you say that he was very fond of recounting it.
Yeah, well, there's a difference, I suppose, between the actual lived experience in the moment
Hmm.
and the stories we tell about them, right? That's
Yeah.
something Tolkien
You, yeah.
certainly did in.
You mentioned the stage at which he's at in his life. So correct me if I'm wrong. This is coming, I think 1951 is when it was published, the Homecoming. Is that correct?
53.
53, thank you. So he would have been around 60 years old at the time. That's like I guess about 10 years after World War II, in which Christopher fought. And then it wasn't just Christopher, right? It was several of
Michael.
his Michael
Yeah.
as well. Okay. So then, so he's 60 years old. This is probably the most lucid then, the most kind of the most composed he is on war. Would you say that?
Might, yeah. There's a well, it's one reading I think that scholars have proposed for well, the standard takeaway from the Homecoming comes not from the verse drama itself, but from the end note overmode, right?
Hmm.
Where he tries to shake things up in terms of the scholarship on the Battle of Maldon. And there, there's maybe an easy thread that says like, okay, when Tolkien was young, yeah, like everybody else, he thought Maldon was about macho man, was about the great man, the old graybeard warrior, um, yeah, engaging in the sporting battle and finding glory in defeat, right? Whereas he's quite critical, of course, of Beorhtnoth's decision there in the Homecoming. But that's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, for one thing, the publication dates don't tell us even part of the story with Tolkien, right? So,
True, right.
so when is he actually writing the one? Tolkien has this ever-resolving sort of revolving sock drawer of drafts, material that's coming out,
Right.
depending on what's going on. So the Homecoming, its origins are still, unfortunately, a little bit shadowy to us,
Hmm.
but it goes way back, right? We're talking about at least the early 1930s that this kind of post-battle dialogue between two people in the dark is beginning to emerge, right? So
Hmm.
that's bubbling for for 2 decades at least, right? And
Right.
so that, again, the publication dates are helpful to a point, but they definitely don't tell a whole story. Uh, but certainly at this point, I mean, again, the 53, it's published just a few months before the first volume of Lord of the Rings comes out.
Right. Yeah.
Tolkien is certainly at the height of his powers as a writer,
Mhm.
and has, yeah, both sort of, I guess, confidence to in scholarship and in writing fantasy, and has the great sort of life's work behind him as far as invented language and mythology to draw on too.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I do see the Homecoming as an important mature work. I'm not going to say it's as good as the Lord of the Rings, but it's not an early child piece or anything like.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I definitely get the sense that it's rather mature. His alliterative verse is really interesting. We do have alliterative verse in the Lord of the Rings, as you well know, the list of the living creatures that Treebeard names.
Mhm.
And I think from a metrical standpoint, it's really interesting because the modern English language really struggles with this alliterative verse. It's so modern English is so iambic, and Old English poetry has one half line type that can be iambic, And Tolkien uses it like 100 times in like 50 lines. But it's the rarest type in actual Old English verse.
Yeah,
The Treebeard song is the example where Tolkien actually gets to use the A type, which is oh, what's the opposite of an iamb? Um, I can't remember, but I don't know. It's it's a stressed position and then an unstressed position over like
right,
twice.
right,
And so he gets to what is it like Beaver the Builder, Bear Bee Hunter, or something like that. That's another type, a D type. Um, I prefer that poem actually to the Homecoming, at least metrically, because it's more true to the
yeah,
actual meter.
yeah, yeah. Well, so I know you've studied a little bit of the those earlier, say, trial pieces, right? Tolkien
Yeah.
was writing and trying to write Old English poetry in modern English, alliterative verse in modern English for many many years. I mean, I think a lot. You're more of a metrical expert than I am, Graham. I think, but the Homecoming is impressive, perhaps not for the sense of giving us the kind of half line variety that we see in Beowulf, but it's amazing that Tolkien's made it sort of flexible enough to
Mhm.
pull off a dramatic
It's
dialogue.
seriously impressive. Yeah, it's a seriously impressive metrical work, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think some of those other pieces we see in the Lord of the Rings are effective and quite moving too.
Mhm.
The verses that we hear in Book Five, right, where the Rohirric poets are
Right.
kind
Yeah.
of on the Pelennor fields and the siege of Gondor and the fall of Snowmane and the enshrining these stories in verse.
Hmm.
It's cool stuff. So all that early work, undergraduate work at Leeds, right, kind of pays off.
Yeah.
Those chunks of poetry that are you know,
Yeah.
so skippable, but so wonderful.
Oh, I wouldn't skip him. I wouldn't skip him for the world.
Me neither.
So I want to real quick explain kind of the context to the viewers. We're talking about the Battle of Maldon here, which happened on this day, 1,034 years ago. So this is the 1,034th year anniversary. A big year
We
for
rolled
Maldon
out the
scholarship.
red carpet.
Um, the book that Peter wrote is about Tolkien's kind of this there was a battle 1,034 years ago in which the Vikings attempted to land near Ipswich in a town called Maldon. They were prevented by the English army, who was commanded by the alderman Beorhtnoth. And there's a poem about that battle. And Tolkien, who was obviously a scholar of said poem, wrote a fictional dialogue between two men who are sent by the monks at the nearby cathedral of Ely. And so that's what Tolkien wrote. He wrote essentially a post-mortem, um, like kind of dialogue between these two characters. Do you want to say a little bit about just kind of the general aspect of the dialogue? Like what kind of what is going on in Tolkien's head when he writes it? Like what is his like intent in this in writing this dialogue?
Yeah, well, first off, it's a sequel, right?
A sequel. That's yeah, okay.
Yeah, right. And if you're an American audience who doesn't have the pleasure of studying the Battle of Malden in your introduction to Old English courses, right? This is all new to you, right? And
Yeah.
so, and perhaps, and there's a great sort of irony, I think, in the title, right? The Homecoming. That sounds like an awesome eighth grade dance, or maybe a sort of big
Spider-Man movie.
parade, right? Yeah. Sounds like good times, but but you quickly notice if you can get into the alliterative verse dialogue that this is
Mhm.
not going to be a festive occasion, right? So Tolkien gives a little bit of scene setting in the introductory note, Beorhtnoth's death, and says that here my two characters are my own inventions, right? I'm drawing on some historical sources that we know, for instance, that Beorhtnoth is buried at Ely Abbey, right? His missing head replaced by a ball of wax and all that, right? Um, but we don't know, of course, how how he got from point A to point B. So here's Tolkien kind of inventing a scenario in which two of the Elderman's servants, Tidwald and Torthelm, have gone on this little rescue mission, if you will, right? They arrive. It's the day after the battle, and darkness has fallen. The moon is foundered, right? It's pitch black, and they're sifting through all the corpses, all the muck and the mud, trying to bring back the body of their dead lord.
Right.
And as they do so, right, they're chatting, right? And we have these really two clearly defined characters, right? Perspectives, but also characters, right? Tidwald is a veteran, right? He's a farmer.
Mhm.
Uh, he's much older, much more grizzled. You might even say cynical, right? He's got a job to do. He doesn't like it, but he doesn't want to waste time spontaneously bursting into song, or he doesn't have
Right.
these heroic illusions that his younger counterpart, Torthelmer, Tata for short, has, right? Tata's family business is poetry, right? He's a gleeman's son,
Hmm.
and it's clear from the beginning that he's never had to do a a chore like this, right? He's
Hmm.
not experienced with battle or with cleaning up battlefields. He's not seen dead bodies before, and he's absolutely terrified.
Right.
Uh, and so he's sort of processing this on the fly using the only tools he really has, which are the old legends, right? The old songs, the old poetry that he's sort of well versed in. And so it's a kind of crushing reality check for him, and it's really kind of fascinating, moving dialogue and in sharp contrast between the old vet and the young sort of romantic as they try to figure out what happened in the battle and try to bring back the Duke's body.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of when we were in Oxford together of listening to you and our mutual friend Chip Crane read this aloud. And I'm aware that this is something that you do at least annually with him, or maybe twice a year. And that's been going on for quite a while now. So you have recited this at least from you play Tata, right?
Yeah, it's my youthful good looks and
Well, you've been reciting it at least from the position of Tata for years now, several times. Maybe would you say it's been 50 times yet? Um,
wow.
it, do you think that that has kind of given you any sort of insight that you could share with us on like because it's Tolkien's like it's really his only written performative piece as far as I'm aware. Like it's the only piece that he wrote that seems to have been intended for performance. And you have obviously been an actor now in this kind of Tolkien performance for quite a while. If I were to want to find insights on Shakespeare, one of the people that I would ask is like a veteran Shakespearean actor. If I wanted to find insights on Tolkien, what could you tell us as a veteran Tolkienian actor?
Yeah. Well, Well, yeah. So one quick note: there's some really interesting recent work by Anna Small about first studying the sort of a draft of the Homecoming that's sort of not well known that appears in the archive at Leeds, and that perhaps was uh, a gift from Tolkien to his colleague and his friend Evie Gordon, who, of course, um, edited the 1937 edition of the Battle of Maldon, right? and did a lot of, in fact, performance work and work with Tolkien in building up the English program at Leeds in the early 1920s. Anyway, she had sort of made a study of the draft's stage directions, which are a little bit different from what's published, and also in some cases
No
much
kidding.
robust. So some really interesting stuff there, and thinking more about how serious Tolkien maybe was about making this, performance possible, right? Um, uh, and of course, um, one of the really nice sort of side effects of this publication of the Battle of Maldon is that the publishers decided to clean up the audio and make much more widely available Tolkien's own tape recording of the drama done in his study in the early 1950s, and where he plays both parts, right? Which is I think pretty challenging and pretty just really awesome to hear him in character, and just thinking about how he imagined the scene playing out, and he's thinking also about how it will play out on the radio, because this is sort of in response to the BBC's plan to run a professional radio drama based on the Homecoming. Sadly, that did run twice, I believe, and somehow does not survive. Though we do know that Tolkien found it pretty disappointing. Um, so yeah, but I mean, I guess the first thing I would say about the performance of the Homecoming is I think it's the only way to understand the Homecoming, and not that you need to go out LARPing by the riverside or something. But my first serious look at that text was in Verlyn Flieger's graduate seminar, and we spent a class period divvying up the reading and reading aloud, sort of getting into that sort of round table performance aspect. And I don't know that there's another way to do that, to really feel the characters, feel their personalities, the voices, feel the alliterative verse, out loud. It all contributes, and to get a feel also for the kind of eeriness of the scene, right? The hard to do in Tall's Hall, but that sense of darkness and spookiness, right? That you would get out of doors without a ton of light pollution, and of course surrounded by the dead bodies of your friends and enemies, right? It's extremely performable, extremely beautiful. You wonder what could be done with it in a professional production. It would be quite cool to see staged, and to see how people would pull that off. Um, but yeah, as far as like understanding, I mean, your opening salvo here about war, romance, and waste, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's coming through really loud and clear in the Homecoming. But you do have to lend an ear, and I think it's really the best way to experience the text.
Yeah, I think the part of the homecoming that really hits me the hardest is when they encounter the gravediggers. And I'm sure that that's probably the most impactful part for a lot of people. But when this Tada just kind of stumbles upon these gravediggers and kills one of them, thinking that they're Danes, and then is sort of bragging about it, and he's told that was probably just some poor wretch that you just killed. There's no need for more English blood, spoiled on this land, and it's this kind of really sobering moment where he has achieved at first what he thinks to be like his first like heroic act. He has read all of these poems, he has heard so much about this, and then he does something that he can see like that he considers to be this great heroic act, and then is
Yeah,
immediately kind of brought back down to earth.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, it's devastating, and it really, yeah, you really get those peaks and valleys, right?
mhm.
His excitement at finding his hero's sword right on the field, right? Probably never got to handle that back I say the mead hall, but I don't think we're really in mead hall days. Although the poem does almost make you imagine that you're in an older period, a sort of yeah, a sort of uh, an environment more like Herat than yeah, late 10th century England. Um, yeah, it's I think it's a Hobbity moment too, I gotta say. I've been thinking about this kind of a lot more
Wait,
recently.
what do you mean by that?
Yeah, that you mentioned my essay in the volume, right? That kind of walks through a few of the kind of connections we can see between Tolkien's work on Maldon and development of
Mhm.
Homecoming and the more familiar, fantasy works. But a piece that I didn't really explicitly advance there is that like I think that we can see in these two kind of anonymous poor Englishmen on an impossible quest. I think we can kind of see an important ingredient and element in the invention of hobbits, right? Which is obviously what really makes a name for Tolkien in the end, right? But in their sort of latent heroism and their distinctly sort of unheroic character, but their sort of doggedness and their I don't know the gritty and the human touch that we get in fantasy, which I think becomes a hallmark of Tolkien's fantasy. What makes the Lord of the Rings so approachable and so moving is that sort of contrast, the sense that our point of view characters are just little fellows, right, in over their heads, right, and yet they're entering into a world of story and legend and myth and these sort of larger than life figures. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a good bit lately, and it has a little bit to do with this idea that the Homecoming also is much older than you might expect from its publication date in 1953. But is really going back at least to that period in which hobbits are beginning to appear in Tolkien's, bedtime stories to his kids, right? And eventually culminating in the publication of The Hobbit in 1937. Um, yeah, there's this element of of the halflings, I think, in both Tita and Tata, our two leads in the Homecoming.
Right. I am always at least when I first read The Homecoming, I hadn't started learning Latin at all. And so when I got to the end, the monks, you at least we are treated to the monks chanting in Latin.
Yeah.
They're chanting the Dirge, which to Tolkien would have been very familiar. Not only would he have understood what it meant, but he was Catholic. He had been to a few funerals, and back then the Dirge was chanted in Latin at those funerals. That being said, he also knew Elvish, but when he puts Elvish in The Lord of the Rings, the characters don't know it. At least most of them don't, and the reader
Mhm.
doesn't know it. And for me, and I imagine also for the two protagonists, the Latin is kind of alien. It's not alien in the sense that it's kind of like new, but it's alien in the sense that it doesn't it doesn't like it doesn't really you can't like understand it, so to speak. And I'm really moved by that kind of ending of them just kind of going into the darkness. It's obviously it's just words on the page, but I almost feel like my own vision starts to darken, as I'm reading that, and then you get this like other language, and presumably they wouldn't have understood it either, and I think that it's very dark, it's very kind of mysterious and confusing.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're because we've left them. We can hear them, the wagon creaking down the road, right?
Mhm.
But then that scene has faded entirely, right? We're seeing, yeah, Beorhtnoth's funeral. We're seeing that their quest is complete, right? but the real ones listening in are this is the most confusing part of all, right?
Mhm.
Our Vikings come in and we get this intrusion of rhyme, right? Sadly, they sing the monks of Ely Isle, row, men, row. Let us listen here a while. Um, so to your point about being moved by or intrigued or scared by a language that you don't fully understand. I don't think these beer swilling Vikings are Latin scholars, right? And yet we have them kind of checking their boats on the waters and like being strangely moved by the funeral of the man they they just beheaded, right? Uh,
Yeah.
it's deeply, yeah, puzzling and moving and sort of sweeping in a way where and Tolkien's kind of gotten away from this really tight, obviously dramatic alliterative dialogue between these two figures, and instead is trying to make a larger statement about, yeah, the passage of time and a sort of movement of history, right? He's drawing on this legend of Knut and thinking about, well, the end of alliterative poetry, the end of Anglo-Saxon England, the uh,
Yeah.
yeah, changing times. Yeah,
I'll never forget when you pointed that out to me, that that rhyming passage at the end, this kind of intrusion of a different of an end rhyme as opposed to an alliterative rhyme. And because that's exactly what happens in the poem The Battle of Maldon. There are lines that have end rhyme, which is it's not completely foreign to Old English poetry, but it really kind of is. And lines like Beorhtnoth mathalode board hafanode, like that's kind of shocking,
yeah,
especially in like epic alliterative heroic verse. There's one other poem that I can think of in Old English that rhymes. It's called the rhyming poem, and it's just kind of like cute, It's just kind of like a gimmick. It doesn't really say much. It's just kind of like wisdom staves, and you could tell the poet was kind of just doing it to say like, hey, check it out, like I can rhyme. But
yeah,
In Malden, you really feel like it's an artistic effect.
yeah,
Um, I don't know
yeah,
if, yeah,
yeah. I love. I do think I included a few notes that Tolkien made about those lines in particular in the volume, where he sort of waxes on the perhaps a failure of taste or the irresistible pleasure of a jingle for a poet, right? Where you have to I like the prose writer, right? You're sometimes unable to murder your darlings, or you want to do a little epic rap line or something like just for fun. Your tastes may fail, Tolkien says, right? But perhaps we're also not the best judges of this poetry today, right?
yeah.
Again, it takes a scholarly knowledge and a sort of sympathetic ear to try to understand, yeah, what's going on here and how does this poetry work, right? How does it work on us?
There's a commentary on the Aeneid that we have, I think, from the fourth century or the fifth century, and there are several lines in the Aeneid where Virgil alliterates, and the commentator writes on one of these lines like, this was considered impressive in like old Latin, and now we all recognize it to be like disgusting. Which is hilarious, He kind of makes the opposite accusation against Virgil, that Virgil is just like, kind of having fun and maybe commits a bit of a you know what what should I say about this? That it's just kind of cute, it's not really like appropriate for like
Yeah,
high poetry.
right.
But it's hilarious because that's alliteration, whereas, in Old English poetry, it's end rhyme that kind of gets that accusation.
Yeah, yeah,
I think this is a good opportunity to pivot to your to the tradition of versification essay, that's also included in the book. It's after Tolkien's translation of the Battle of Maldon, which I had a lot of fun reading. there's this essay, The Tradition of Versification in Old English. Uh, Anyone who's read the Monsters and Critics essay will be familiar with the really, really, really famous analogy of the tower. That is this idea that this guy finds all of these stones. Would you like to recap the analogy of the tower real quick?
Yeah, I don't know how well it works in paraphrase. I mean, it's so beautiful to read, but I mean, can we read it?
I can pull it up real quick.
Yeah.
Um,
All right. So I would express the whole industry in yet another allegory. A man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming, perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over, with no little labor, in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it, and forgot even the stones. They all said, "This tower is most interesting." But they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it is in." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He's such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did not he restore the old house?" He had no sense of proportion. But from the top of the tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea.
wow. Every
Yeah.
time I hear it, it gets better.
Goose-
It it is a bit opaque, I think, to people who don't really understand what he's saying. And the next one that we're going to talk about is even more opaque. But just to meditate on this tower real quick, um, what Tolkien is saying, if you'll allow me to interpret it, is he's referring to the scholars of Beowulf at the time, at least, and in the century leading up to when he delivered that address. Beowulf obviously is building on a perhaps even 1,000 year long tradition of Germanic mythology. And there was a lot of scholarship attempting to kind of discern what stories were being alluded to and maybe attempt to rebuild those stories. And in those attempts, there was a growing frustration that the Beowulf poet had written kind of a fairy tale about monsters and dragons when they, these scholars were much more interested in the stories being alluded to in Beowulf of kind of man on man conflict. If anyone here has heard of the Finnsburg fragment, that the Finnsburg saga, that is a particular one. The story between Ingeld and Hrothgar, and all of these kind of dramas that the Beowulf poet clearly knew of, but decided to instead write about dragons. Which was frustrating to a lot of these scholars, but Tolkien attempts to make the defense that maybe he actually just wanted to write about dragons. Can you really blame him? Would you correct anything that I've just said? Would you add anything to that?
Oh, no, no. The essay is meant to kind of fight back against an attitude towards Beowulf that's really about just sort of mining it, right? I mean, I think
Mhm.
that metaphor of building and craftsmanship is runs through the entire piece, right? And he's critical of those, even those, of course, in his own field, philologists and folklorists and archaeologists. Everyone's wanting to sort of uh, excavate it for their own purposes, right? But in
Right.
so doing, they they damage the structure of the thing, right?
Hmm.
They fail to recognize what it actually is, right? Which for Tolkien is well, and I think it's not a not a controversial take. It's poetry.
Right.
So it's Tolkien's attempt to read it sort of on its own terms or on
Hmm.
the poet's terms.
Well, you know, Tolkien clearly liked to talk in these analogies. And I hope no one here is exhausted after hearing that because I've got another one from this tradition of versification essay that I'll read here. So he's describing the process of language change, and he kind of characterizes languages as trees. Um, and he says that it is believed that in slow time, the aberrations of the descendants of these trees, that is, will evolve a new beech with leaves of different form. Are there not some that simulate the oak? So in time, the meter will dissolve and change. Kind of the way that languages change. And he continues here, but if language is in some way like this, verse is not. Here, rather, comes the woodman. And in the forest he cuts boughs and gathers flowers to weave a garland for his brows, to brighten his halls, or to adorn the temple of his gods. He chooses the shapes and colors from the riches of the wood, and what is not there he cannot take, but of such as there is, he makes a design which resides in no plant or tree, though it may come from the maker of all trees, and must forever remain arboreal. That design can be copied as long as the wood is there and imitated in other lands and woods, and it can be perceived, learned, or taught as a pleasing way of arranging leaves and flowers, as something imposed upon the components separable from the actual garlands of woodmen that have gone before us, even though contemplation of these may be the usual way of learning the pattern. And finally, it is something we can impose upon ourselves with our own individual tastes. We are not trees, and we do not write in meters according solely to the unconscious leaf-like unfolding of our native rhythms. We have each our native rhythms, like trees, but we also have tradition. Both blend in poetry. But the trees make no poetry because they do not conspire to teach the young how their grandsires shaped the leaves. And so um, I'm sure that I actually was listening to a talk of yours in which you kind of alluded to the fact that this was probably addressed to a live audience, at least at one point. And I think we might be able to count on our fingers the amount of people that actually understood what he was talking about in the moment. It's hard enough to read, but to hear that, kind of explained. Can you kind of translate what I just read?
I can try, yeah. Michael Drought reviewed the book in Tolkien Studies, and a very reasonable criticism is made that I offer like no critical apparatus for this. Obviously, the most difficult section of the book, right?
Hmm.
One that maybe even in the planning for the volume wasn't necessarily part of the picture. But in reading it and in discovering passages like the one you just read, I felt it was necessary to include, even if it would have taken me an extra few years and an extra 300 pages to sort of uh, uh, explain for the reader. But yeah, okay. So we see Tolkien's incredible gift for this sort of allegorical sketches, right? As you mentioned, the segue from the Beowulf Tower. But the thrust of this essay, well, ultimately, Tolkien's trying um, to sort of justify the work that the Maldon poet has done, right? To sort of take the Maldon poet seriously, and he's going against the grain here in the the general wisdom that as a late Anglo-Saxon period poet that that there's just been a general and like natural decline with language change, so poetry, so meter has decayed, and so the Malden poet is trying to imitate the greats like the Beowulf poet in the older days, but he simply can't hack it, right? And so this is just sort of faulty, derivative, yeah, just poor poetry, right? Um, but knowing Tolkien and knowing the kind of care he took to teach Malden and to write its sequel or prequel on the Homecoming, right? He's really kind of at pains here to give the Maldon poet some credit, right? And to again try to take his poem on its own terms. Um, so the contrast here is between the sort of natural evolutionary change in language that happens all the time while we're not looking, right? And something actually for Tolkien more fixed and more permanent, right? Which is meter, right? So the rules that we impose on the raw material of language to make poetry, to please ourselves, to make art. Um, so um, so we're contrasting this idea of the slow, million year plus evolution of trees that we just watch happen in time lapse versus the conscious artistic moves of the poets here expressed by the woodman, right? So taking the raw material of the forest, right, and his meter is the design of the garland, right? The blueprint of the garland, the genre maybe in which he's just ways of that he's folded these flowers and these boughs, right? And of course, you can make individual examples of that garland gathering supplies from the woods, right? Here we have, I think, a really moving kind of connection to his theories expressed in fairy stories too, the ideas of subcreation, right? The we inherit this desire to make things, right, from God, and we can only make with the material that's available to us, right? Um, okay, so the idea that there's a that meter, that the rules of poetry are separable from the language, the ingredients that we pour into our meters, right? So elsewhere he uses a kind of cookery metaphor that I really enjoyed. Like we have a recipe, right? And that's not the same as the pie that comes out of the oven, right? Even though that pie is one cook's expression of the recipe or following of the recipe. Um, yeah, does that make do you agree?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I figured that you would like that that cooking one as well as someone of a high culinary taste, if you'll permit me to describe you in that way. But I think that that's really interesting. It's also pretty well in line with the philosophy of the time that was coming out. I'm not sure if you've ever heard the name Hans Urs von Balthasar. He was a contemporary philosopher, if I'm not mistaken. I think he was contemporary with Tolkien. Um, and he writes the same way about free will in that you have he describes free will as like a you have like a script, so to speak, for let's say you have something like the Homecoming, but when you perform that script, no one else can do it in the way that you do it, and no one else ever would be able to or ever will do it in the way that you do it. In the sense that just like the every tiny little intonation of your voice, you're not deviating from the script. And if you were to deviate from the script, that could potentially be a big problem. But even if you are perfectly sticking to the script, you are going to do it in your own way. And I think that that's really interesting. That she seems to share that idea with meter, which makes a lot of sense. I really like these garlands. You can imagine in his own writing of the Homecoming, he's taking a pattern of garland, so to speak, of Old English poetry. That is the alliterative Old English meter. He's taking that kind of garland pattern, but he's using the modern English tree of his own language, in the same way that, for example, Longfellow would use like the the modern, at least his dialect of English, to write in dactylic hexameter, of the Greeks, and he takes that kind of pattern of garland, so you can kind of almost imagine that the leaves don't really fit anymore.
Right,
Like
right.
it's really hard to bend these leaves into the shape that Tolkien is trying in the Homecoming and in things like the shield shaving poem or the Ents list of living creatures or the Rohirrim poetry. Like
Yeah.
it's really difficult to bend it in that pattern. But he
Yeah.
does manage
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah. It's that's great. It's difficult, but it's possible.
Hmm.
It's worth trying, right? There's a bit here where he says, let's not forget the poets again, right? We can
Hmm.
defy the changing times with the this potent weapon of purpose, right? We want to make art in this old way or in this new way, or we want to try something different, right? Those meters for Tolkien, those old recipes can be dusted off, right? And they might not feel relevant or natural or easy to us, right? Because of our changing times, our changing language. But they still have value, right? And they still have again, to go back to the cookery metaphor, like a unique kind of savor and a unique sort of flavor and power for us, right? I mean, yeah. So the subtext of defending the Maldon poet is immediate here, but then behind it all too is Tolkien like saying, "Hey guys, I I really want to revive alliterative meters, and I think I can do it, and I think it's worth trying anyway."
Yeah, he wasn't the only one either. Auden writes an alliterative meter around that time. Lewis writes an alliterative meter at least once, I think. Um, didn't really catch on though. You don't see many poets nowadays doing it.
Yeah, yeah, right. These revivals are always doomed to fail, but but it's worth trying anyway.
Yeah.
Certainly alliteration as a decorative element
Mhm.
is very much alive and part of our language, part of our poetry.
Right. So then in the last part of the book, once we get past the versification, we have a few appendices. And the last element of the book is your own essay on the relationship between this work and The Lord of the Rings. Obviously, if people want to read that essay, they should buy the book. But could you tell us, or maybe whet the appetites of the listener, maybe one or two examples of these connections that we see here? They're so close in publication, but what do we see?
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I guess one of the big threads, right, is that here in Malden, Tolkien's as he does in his studies of Beowulf too, right? We're seeing this. He says the most famous lines in Old English, right, come from Bertbald, right, the old retainer. His little death speech here, beautifully captures that northern heroic code, right? And so that he calls it elsewhere, it's a doctrine of doomed resistance, right? This attitude that really gives us like that central, say, to Norse mythology too, that gives the idea of Odin gathering his warriors, right, in Valhalla and the impending uh, Ragnarok, right? This sense of needing to acquit yourself well in a battle that you're going to lose, a battle of impossible odds, right? I mean, that's all over the place in Tolkien, right? Both, yeah, yeah. He's critical of that attitude. Also, sort of seems to celebrate it at times, right? Obviously, in Lord of the Rings, that that's a major plot thread, right? Our heroes decide to essentially sacrifice themselves in this, as Legolas would say, a diversion. They 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 storm the Black Gate, right? And they hope that Sauron will think it's the new Ring Lord, so cocky, right? Wielding Isildur's sword, right? They're coming out here. They're knowing that they're not going to come home. They're expecting not to come home from this battle, but this idea of going down swinging instead of sort of hiding in the hills or making a deal or things like that, right? that's very much again poised against the heroic and impossible quest of the hobbits on the other side, right? And it's, I suppose, ironic that it's the heroes are relegated to this sort of decoy side of things, but we see that attitude still sort of playing a part in Lord of the Rings. Uh, we see that also really clearly in Tolkien's great saga, I guess you could call it, Turin Turambar, all about this like impossible struggle against fate, right? How you sort of Turin is very much a sort of Beowulf, Beorhtnoth, uh, Eddaic character, right, for Tolkien, right? Someone um, who's dogged by Morgoth's curse, right, and tries to meet it, with a sword, right, instead of a smile. Um, yeah, I mean that's a big thread. And then the other thing, that I alluded to earlier was this idea that again I really do believe that these these two figures, Tita and Tata, are helping Tolkien kind of understand what hobbits are or what they're going to become and how they fit into that, how they allow him to explore those sort of heroic scenes and heroic world.
Yeah. Do you think that it's a criticism of figures like, I'll take Elrond for an example, that he seems to, a lot of the elves seem to actually turn and leave as their Mayan Lýtloth, as the Maldon poet says, as their kind of strength fades. Do you think that that's a criticism, or do you think that Tolkien is kind of endorsing that kind of mentality of like, well, I don't really have a part to play anymore. It's just time for me to go.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never thought of them as, yeah, as like Godric fleeing for the woods, but I mean that's a piece, the elves seem so sort of a little bit haughty and a little bit, like, oh, these sort of infallibly wise figures in the Lord of the Rings, but
That can jump up falling stones
yeah,
as they
really good. They're like better than Tony Hawk at skateboarding. Yeah, amazing. But of course, the Silmarillion is all about like elves behaving terribly and Feanor, right? And that's sort of very much a figure of basically demonic pride, right? I mean, along the lines of Turin and all this sort of this heroic attitude, this sense of pride, that Tolkien's quite critical of. Yeah, I'd have to think more about that, but yeah, the elves' departure. Um,
it's typically characters that I think Tolkien would want us to believe are rather wise as well. I don't think he intends them to come across as like cowardly. It's just interesting that there is this idea that their strength is fading and therefore it is time for them to kind of I think it might be an endorsement of that mentality, but I'm not sure.
hmm. Yeah, well, Elrond has, you know, given us the key here, right? He says, "I wish I could give you a host of elven warriors,
Mhm.
in the good gear of the old days, but I don't have enough left. And I also want to remind you that this isn't that kind of story, right? That sort of like martial heroism isn't gonna cut it, right? Against what we're up against is gonna require something a little bit more subtle and a little, yeah, unexpected, right? The hobbits.
Yeah.
Um, hmm.
I think that if Bertnoth had been at the at any of the battles against Sauron, I think that they probably would have tricked him in the same way that the Vikings did. I can see that happening.
Yeah, yeah, you see that in the history of Gondor too, right? Um, I want to say uh, one of the last kings, right, is called out by by the Witch King, right? It says, you don't have
Yeah.
the balls to face me in single combat. So he rides off and is never heard from again, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, because it's a theme that Tolkien is very much concerned with, interested in, with, preoccupied by. And I think it's yeah, I genuinely, we all have our pet texts, but the Homecoming really does shed some great light on that. It helps you kind of see that playing out in a different way, and the stories again that are much more familiar to most readers.
Well, we're coming up on time. Would you like to kind of give a final address to the viewers before we cut it?
Well, I just thank you for tuning in. This is a great channel. You're a star.
Oh,
Great.
wow.
Uh, uh, yeah, I'll have to watch more of your videos. Total War in Latin or whatever.
Oh
This is
yeah.
the
Oh
dirtiest
yeah.
channel I've ever seen, but I'm here for it. I think it's really wonderful.
And if
Um,
anyone hasn't gotten their copy yet, my edition is actually signed. I'm not there. You might be able to find like a signed edition on eBay somewhere. But anyway, highly recommend it. Beautiful book. Also, Sensitive Tales Untold is a really great read if you're interested in about the kind of the reason why Tolkien's mythology are so kind of appealing to us. I think that that kind of has the key to understanding at least one aspect of kind of Tolkien's artistic appeal. Other than that, it was really great having you on, Prof G. I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone found this entertaining and educational. Yeah, until next time, Fardath Yesunde.